The Moon and Sixpence by W. Somerset Maugham. Chapter 16. What followed showed that Mrs. Strickland was a woman of character. Whatever anguish she suffered, she concealed. She saw shrewdly that the world is quickly bored by the recital of misfortune, and willingly avoids the sight of distress. Whenever she went out, and compassion for her misadventure made her friends eager to entertain her, she bore a demeanour that was perfect. She was brave, but not too obviously, cheerful, but not brazenly, and she seemed more anxious to listen to the troubles of others than to discuss her own. Whenever she spoke of her husband, it was with pity. Her attitude towards him at first perplexed me. One day she said to me, "You know, I'm convinced you were mistaken about Charles being alone. From what I've been able to gather from certain sources that I can't tell you, I know that he didn't leave England by himself." "In that case he has a positive genius for covering up his tracks." She looked away and slightly coloured. "What I mean is, if any one talks to you about it, please don't contradict it if they say he eloped with someone." "Of course not." She changed the conversation as though it were a matter to which she attached no importance. I discovered presently that a peculiar story was circulating among her friends. They said that Charles Strickland had become infatuated with a French dancer whom he had first seen in the ballet at the Empire, and had accompanied her to Paris. I could not find out how this had arisen, but singularly enough it created much sympathy for Mrs. Strickland, and at the same time gave her not a little prestige. This was not without its use in the calling which she had decided to follow. Colonel MacAndrew had not exaggerated when he said that she would be penniless, and it was necessary for her to earn her own living as quickly as she could. She made up her mind to profit by her acquaintance with so many writers, and without loss of time began to learn shorthand and typewriting. Her education made it likely that she would be a typist more efficient than the average, and her story made her claims appealing. Her friends promised to send her work, and took care to recommend her to all theirs. The MacAndrews, who were childless and in easy circumstances, arranged to undertake the care of the children, and Mrs. Strickland had only herself to provide for. She let her flat and sold her furniture. She settled in 2 tiny rooms in Westminster, and faced the world anew. She was so efficient that it was certain she would make a success of the adventure. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17. It was about 5 years after this that I decided to live in Paris for a while. I was growing stale in London. I was tired of doing much the same thing every day. My friends pursued their course with uneventfulness. They had no longer any surprises for me, and when I met them I knew pretty well what they would say. Even their love affairs had a tedious banality. We were like tramcars running on their lines from terminus to terminus, and it was possible to calculate within small limits the number of passengers they would carry. Life was ordered too pleasantly. I was seized with panic. I gave up my small apartment, sold my few belongings, and resolved to start afresh. I called on Mrs. Strickland before I left. I had not seen her for some time, and I noticed changes in her. It was not only that she was older, thinner, and more lined. I think her character had altered. She had made a success of her business, and now had an office in Chancery Lane. She did little typing herself, but spent her time correcting the work of the 4 girls she employed. She had had the idea of giving it a certain daintiness, and she made much use of blue and red inks. She bound the copy in coarse paper that looked vaguely like watered silk, in various pale colours, and she had acquired a reputation for neatness and accuracy. She was making money, but she could not get over the idea that to earn her living was somewhat undignified, and she was inclined to remind you that she was a lady by birth. She could not help bringing into her conversation the names of people she knew, which would satisfy you she had not sunk in the social scale. She was a little ashamed of her courage and business capacity, but was delighted that she was going to dine the next night with a K.C. who lived in South Kensington. She was pleased to be able to tell you that her son was at Cambridge, and it was with a little laugh that she spoke of the rush of dances to which her daughter, just out, was invited. I suppose I said a very stupid thing. "Is she going into your business?" I asked. "Oh no, I wouldn't let her do that," Mrs. Strickland answered. "She's so pretty, I'm sure she'll marry well." "I should have thought it would be a help to you." "Several people have suggested she should go on the stage, but of course I couldn't consent to that. I know all the chief dramatists, and I could get her a part tomorrow, but I shouldn't like her to mix with all sorts of people." I was a little chilled by Mrs. Strickland's exclusiveness. "Do you ever hear of your husband?" "No, I haven't heard a word. He may be dead for all I know." "I may run across him in Paris. Would you like me to let you know about him?" She hesitated a minute. "If he's in any real want, I'm prepared to help him a little. I'd send you a certain sum of money, and you could give it him gradually as he needed it." "That's very good of you," I said. But I knew it was not kindness that prompted the offer. It is not true that suffering ennobles the character. Happiness does that sometimes, but suffering, for the most part, makes men petty and vindictive. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18. In point of fact, I met Strickland before I had been a fortnight in Paris. I quickly found myself a tiny apartment on the 5th floor of a house in the Rue des Dames, and for a couple of £100 bought at a second-hand dealer's enough furniture to make it habitable. I arranged with the concierge to make my coffee in the morning and to keep the place clean. Then I went to see my friend, Dirk Stroeve. Dirk Stroeve was one of those persons whom, according to your character, you cannot think of without derisive laughter or an embarrassed shrug of the shoulders. Nature had made him a buffoon. He was a painter, but a very bad one, whom I had met in Rome, and I still remembered his pictures. He had a genuine enthusiasm for the commonplace. His soul palpitating with love of art, he painted the models who hung about the stairway of Bernini in the Piazza di Spagna, undaunted by their obvious picturesqueness, and his studio was full of canvases on which were portrayed mustachioed, large-eyed peasants in peaked hats, urchins in becoming rags, and women in bright petticoats. Sometimes they lounged at the steps of a church, and sometimes dallied among cypresses against a cloudless sky. Sometimes they made love by a Renaissance wellhead, and sometimes they wandered through the Campagna by the side of an ox wagon. They were carefully drawn and carefully painted. A photograph could not have been more exact. One of the painters at the Villa Medici had called him le maître de la boîte au chocolat. To look at his pictures, you would have thought that Monet, Manet, and the rest of the Impressionists had never been. "I don't pretend to be a great painter," he said. "I am not a Michelangelo, no. But I have something. I sell. I bring romance into the homes of all sorts of people. Do you know they buy my pictures not only in Holland, but in Norway and Sweden and Denmark? It's mostly merchants who buy them, and rich tradesmen. You can't imagine what the winters are like in those countries, so long and dark and cold. They like to think that Italy is like my pictures. That's what they expect. That's what I expected Italy to be before I came here." And I think that was the vision that had remained with him always, dazzling his eyes so that he could not see the truth, and, notwithstanding the brutality of fact, he continued to see with the eyes of the spirit an Italy of romantic brigands and picturesque ruins. It was an ideal that he painted, a poor one, common and shop soiled, but still it was an ideal, and it gave his character a peculiar charm. It was because I felt this that Dirk Stroeve was not to me, as to others, merely an object of ridicule. His fellow painters made no secret of their contempt for his work, but he earned a fair amount of money, and they did not hesitate to make free use of his purse. He was generous, and the needy, laughing at him because he believed so naively their stories of distress, borrowed from him with effrontery. He was very emotional, yet his feeling, so easily aroused, had in it something absurd, so that you accepted his kindness, but felt no gratitude. To take money from him was like robbing a child, and you despised him because he was so foolish. I imagine that a pickpocket, proud of his light fingers, must feel a sort of indignation with the careless woman who leaves in a cab a vanity bag with all her jewels in it. Nature had made him a butt, but had denied him insensibility. He writhed under the jokes, practical and otherwise, which were perpetually made at his expense, and yet never ceased, it seemed wilfully, to expose himself to them. He was constantly wounded, and yet his good nature was such that he could not bear malice. The viper might sting him, but he never learnt by experience, and had no sooner recovered from his pain than he tenderly placed it once more in his bosom. His life was a tragedy written in the terms of knockabout farce. Because I did not laugh at him, he was grateful to me, and he used to pour into my sympathetic ear the long list of his troubles. The saddest thing about them was that they were grotesque, and the more pathetic they were, the more you wanted to laugh. But, though so bad a painter, he had a very delicate feeling for art, and to go with him to picture galleries was a rare treat. His enthusiasm was sincere, and his criticism acute. He was Catholic. He had not only a true appreciation of the old masters, but sympathy with the moderns. He was quick to discover talent, and his praise was generous. I think I have never known a man whose judgment was surer. And he was better educated than most painters. He was not, like most of them, ignorant of kindred arts, and his taste for music and literature gave depth and variety to his comprehension of painting. To a young man like myself, his advice and guidance were of incomparable value. When I left Rome, I corresponded with him, and about once in 2 months received from him long letters in queer English, which brought before me vividly his spluttering, enthusiastic, gesticulating conversation. Some time before I went to Paris he had married an Englishwoman, and was now settled in a studio in Montmartre. I had not seen him for 4 years, and had never met his wife. End of Chapter 18. Chapter 19. I had not announced my arrival to Stroeve, and when I rang the bell of his studio, on opening the door himself, for a moment he did not know me. Then he gave a cry of delighted surprise, and drew me in. It was charming to be welcomed with so much eagerness. His wife was seated near the stove at her sewing, and she rose as I came in. He introduced me. "Don't you remember?" he said to her. "I've talked to you about him often." And then to me, "But why didn't you let me know you were coming? How long have you been here? How long are you going to stay? Why didn't you come an hour earlier, and we would have dined together?" He bombarded me with questions. He sat me down in a chair, patting me as though I were a cushion, pressed cigars upon me, cakes, wine. He could not let me alone. He was heartbroken because he had no whisky, wanted to make coffee for me, racked his brains for something he could possibly do for me, and beamed and laughed, and in the exuberance of his delight sweated at every pore. "You haven't changed," I said, smiling as I looked at him. He had the same absurd appearance that I remembered. He was a fat little man with short legs, young still, he could not have been more than 30, but prematurely bald. His face was perfectly round, and he had a very high colour, a white skin, red cheeks, and red lips. His eyes were blue and round too. He wore large gold-rimmed spectacles, and his eyebrows were so fair that you could not see them. He reminded you of those jolly fat merchants that Rubens painted. When I told him that I meant to live in Paris for a while, and had taken an apartment, he reproached me bitterly for not having let him know. He would have found me an apartment himself, and lent me furniture. Did I really mean that I had gone to the expense of buying it? And he would have helped me to move in. He really looked upon it as unfriendly that I had not given him the opportunity of making himself useful to me. Meanwhile, Mrs. Stroeve sat quietly mending her stockings without talking, and she listened to all he said with a quiet smile on her lips. "So you see I'm married," he said suddenly. "What do you think of my wife?" He beamed at her and settled his spectacles on the bridge of his nose. The sweat made them constantly slip down. "What on earth do you expect me to say to that?" I laughed. "Really, Dirk," put in Mrs. Stroeve, smiling. But isn't she wonderful? I tell you, my boy, lose no time. Get married as soon as ever you can. I'm the happiest man alive. Look at her sitting there. Doesn't she make a picture? Chardin, eh? I've seen all the most beautiful women in the world. I've never seen any one more beautiful than Madame Derek Stroeve. If you don't be quiet, Dirk, I shall go away." "Mon petit chou," he said. She flushed a little, embarrassed by the passion in his tone. His letters had told me that he was very much in love with his wife, and I could see that he could hardly take his eyes off her. I could not tell if she loved him. Poor pantaloon, he was not an object to excite love. But the smile in her eyes was affectionate, and it was possible that her reserve concealed a very deep feeling. She was not the ravishing creature that his lovesick fancy saw, but she had a grave comeliness. She was rather tall, and her grey dress, simple and quite well cut, did not hide the fact that her figure was beautiful. It was a figure that might have appealed more to the sculptor than to the costumier. Her hair, brown and abundant, was plainly done. Her face was very pale, and her features were good without being distinguished. She had quiet grey eyes. She just missed being beautiful, and in missing it was not even pretty. But when Stroeve spoke of Chardin it was not without reason, and she reminded me curiously of that pleasant housewife in her mob cap and apron, whom the great painter has immortalised. I could imagine her sedately busy among her pots and pans, making a ritual of her household duties, so that they acquired a moral significance. I did not suppose that she was clever or could ever be amusing, but there was something in her grave intentness which excited my interest. Her reserve was not without mystery. I wondered why she had married Dirk Stroeve. Though she was English, I could not exactly place her, and it was not obvious from what rank in society she sprang, what had been her upbringing, or how she had lived before her marriage. She was very silent, but when she spoke it was with a pleasant voice, and her manners were natural. I asked Stroeve if he was working. "Working? I'm painting better than I ever painted before." We sat in the studio, and he waved his hand to an unfinished picture on an easel. I gave a little start. He was painting a group of Italian peasants, in the costume of the Campagna, lounging on the steps of a Roman church. "Is that what you're doing now?" I asked. "Yes, I can get my models here just as well as in Rome." "Don't you think it's very beautiful?" said Mrs. Stroeve. "This foolish wife of mine thinks I'm a great artist," said he. His apologetic laugh did not disguise the pleasure that he felt. His eyes lingered on his picture. It was strange that his critical sense, so accurate and unconventional when he dealt with the work of others, should be satisfied in himself with what was hackneyed and vulgar beyond belief. "Show him some more of your pictures," she said. "Shall I?" Though he had suffered so much from the ridicule of his friends, Dirk Stroeve, eager for praise and naively self-satisfied, could never resist displaying his work. He brought out a picture of two curly-headed Italian urchins playing marble. "Aren't they sweet?" said Mrs. Stroeve. And then he showed me more. I discovered that in Paris he had been painting just the same stale, obviously picturesque things that he had painted for years in Rome. It was all false, insincere, shoddy, and yet no one was more honest, sincere, and frank than Dirk Stroeve. Who could resolve the contradictions? I do not know what put it in my head to ask, "I say, have you by any chance run across a painter called Charles Strickland?" "You don't mean to say you know him?" cried Stroeve. "Beast," said his wife. Stroeve laughed. "Ah, ma pauvre chérie." He went over to her and kissed both her hands. "She doesn't like him. How strange that you should know Strickland." "I don't like bad manners," said Mrs. Stroeve. Dirk, laughing still, turned to me to explain. "You see, I asked him to come here one day and look at my pictures. Well, he came, and I showed him everything I had." Stroeve hesitated a moment with embarrassment. I do not know why he had begun the story against himself. He felt an awkwardness in finishing it. "He looked at my pictures, and he didn't say anything. I thought he was reserving his judgment till the end. And at last I said, 'There, that's the lot.' He said, 'I came to ask you to lend me 20 francs.'" "And Dirk actually gave it him," said his wife indignantly. "I was so taken aback I didn't like to refuse. He put the money in his pocket, just nodded and said thanks, and walked out." Dirk Stroeve, telling the story, had such a look of blank astonishment on his round, foolish face that it was almost impossible not to laugh. "I shouldn't have minded if he'd said my pictures were bad, but he said nothing, nothing." "And you will tell the story, Dirk?" said his wife. It was lamentable that one was more amused by the ridiculous figure cut by the Dutchman than outraged by Strickland's brutal treatment of him. "I hope I shall never see him again," said Mrs. Stroeve. Stroeve smiled and shrugged his shoulders. He had already recovered his good humour. "The fact remains, he's a great artist, a very great artist." "Strickland!" I exclaimed. "It can't be the same man." "A big fellow with a red beard. Charles Strickland, an Englishman." "He had no beard when I knew him, but if he has grown one it might well be red. The man I'm thinking of only began painting 5 years ago." "That's it. He's a great artist." "Impossible." "Have I ever been mistaken?" Dirk asked me. "I tell you he has genius. I'm convinced of it. In 100 years, if you and I are remembered at all, it will be because we knew Charles Strickland." I was astonished, and at the same time I was very much excited. I remembered suddenly my last talk with him. "Where can one see his work?" I asked. "Is he having any success? Where is he living?" "No, he has no success. I don't think he's ever sold a picture. When you speak to men about him, they only laugh. But I know he's a great artist. After all, they laughed at Manet. Corot never sold a picture. I don't know where he lives, but I can take you to see him. He goes to a cafe in the Avenue de Clichy at 7 o'clock every evening. If you like, we'll go there tomorrow." "I'm not sure if he'll wish to see me. I think I may remind him of a time he prefers to forget. But I'll come all the same. Is there any chance of seeing any of his pictures?" "Not from him. He won't show you a thing. There's a little dealer I know who has 2 or 3. But you mustn't go without me. You wouldn't understand. I must show them to you myself." "Dirk, you make me impatient," said Mrs. Stroeve. "How can you talk like that about his pictures when he treated you as he did?" She turned to me. "Do you know, when some Dutch people came here to buy Dirk's pictures, he tried to persuade them to buy Strickland's. He insisted on bringing them here to show." "What did you think of them?" I asked her, smiling. "They were awful." "Ah, sweetheart, you don't understand." "Well, your Dutch people were furious with you. They thought you were having a joke with them." Dirk Stroeve took off his spectacles and wiped them. His flushed face was shining with excitement. "Why should you think that beauty, which is the most precious thing in the world, lies like a stone on the beach for the careless passer-by to pick up idly? Beauty is something wonderful and strange that the artist fashions out of the chaos of the world in the torment of his soul. And when he has made it, it is not given to all to know it. To recognize it, you must repeat the adventure of the artist. It is a melody that he sings to you, and to hear it again in your own heart you want knowledge and sensitiveness and imagination. Why did I always think your pictures beautiful, Dirk? I admired them the very first time I saw them." Stroeve's lips trembled a little. "Go to bed, my precious. I will walk a few steps with our friend, and then I will come back." Chapter 19. Chapter 20. Dirk Stroeve agreed to fetch me on the following evening and take me to the cafe at which Strickland was most likely to be found. I was interested to learn that it was the same as that at which Strickland and I had drunk absinthe when I had gone over to Paris to see him. The fact that he had never changed suggested a sluggishness of habit which seemed to me characteristic. "There he is," said Stroeve as we reached the cafe. Though it was October, the evening was warm, and the tables on the pavement were crowded. I ran my eyes over them, but did not see Strickland. "Look, over there in the corner. He's playing chess." I noticed a man bending over a chessboard, but could only see a large felt hat and a red beard. We threaded our way among the tables till we came to him. "Strickland!" He looked up.
"Ah, hello, Fatty. What do you want?"
"I've brought an old friend to see you." Strickland gave me a glance, and evidently did not recognise me. He resumed his scrutiny of the chessboard.
"Sit down and don't make a noise," he said.
He moved a piece, and straightway became absorbed in the game. Poor Stroeve gave me a troubled look, but I was not disconcerted by so little. I ordered something to drink, and waited quietly until Strickland had finished. I welcomed the opportunity to examine him at my ease. I certainly should never have known him. In the first place, his red beard, ragged and untrimmed, hid much of his face, and his hair was long. But the most surprising change in him was his extreme thinness. It made his great nose protrude more arrogantly. It emphasised his cheekbones. It made his eyes seem larger. There were deep hollows at his temples. His body was cadaverous. He wore the same suit that I had seen him in 5 years before. It was torn and stained, threadbare, and it hung upon him loosely, as though it had been made for someone else. I noticed his hands, dirty, with long nails. They were merely bone and sinew, large and strong, but I had forgotten that they were so shapely. He gave me an extraordinary impression as he sat there, his attention riveted on his game, an impression of great strength, and I could not understand why it was that his emaciation somehow made it more striking. Presently, after moving, he leaned back and gazed with a curious abstraction at his antagonist. This was a fat, bearded Frenchman. The Frenchman considered the position, then broke suddenly into jovial expletives, and with an impatient gesture, gathering up the pieces, flung them into their box. He cursed Strickland freely, then, calling for the waiter, paid for the drinks and left. Stroeve drew his chair closer to the table. "Now I suppose we can talk," he said. Strickland's eyes rested on him, and there was in them a malicious expression. I felt sure he was seeking for some gibe, could think of none, and so was forced to silence. "I've brought an old friend to see you," repeated Stroeve, beaming cheerfully. Strickland looked at me thoughtfully for nearly a minute. I did not speak. "I've never seen him in my life," he said. I don't know why he said this, for I felt certain I had caught a gleam of recognition in his eyes. I was not so easily abashed as I had been some years earlier. "I saw your wife the other day," I said. "I felt sure you'd like to have the latest news of her." He gave a short laugh. His eyes twinkled. "We had a jolly evening together," he said. "How long ago is it?" 5 years. He called for another absinthe. Stroeve, with voluble tongue, explained how he and I had met, and by what an accident we had discovered that we both knew Strickland. I do not know if Strickland listened. He glanced at me once or twice reflectively, but for the most part seemed occupied with his own thoughts, and certainly without Stroeve's babble the conversation would have been difficult. In half an hour the Dutchman, looking at his watch, announced that he must go. He asked whether I would come too. I thought, alone, I might get something out of Strickland, and so answered that I would stay. When the fat man had left, I said: "Dirk Stroeve thinks you're a great artist."
"What the hell do you suppose I care?"
"Will you let me see your pictures?"
"Why should I?"
"I might feel inclined to buy one."
"I might not feel inclined to sell one."
"Are you making a good living?" I asked, smiling. He chuckled.
"Do I look it?"
"You look half starved."
"I am half starved."
"Then come and let's have a bit of dinner."
"Why do you ask me?"
"Not out of charity," I answered coolly. "I don't really care a twopenny damn if you starve or not." His eyes lit up again.
"Come on, then,"
he said, getting up.
"I like a decent meal."
Chapter 21. I let him take me to a restaurant of his choice, but on the way I bought a paper. When we had ordered our dinner, I propped it against a bottle of Saint Galmier and began to read. We ate in silence. I felt him looking at me now and again, but I took no notice. I meant to force him to conversation.
"Is there anything in the paper?"
he said, as we approached the end of our silent meal. I fancied there was in his tone a slight note of exasperation. "I always like to read the feuilleton on the drama," I said. I folded the paper and put it down beside me.
"I've enjoyed my dinner,"
he remarked. "I think we might have our coffee here, don't you?"
"Yes."
We lit our cigars. I smoked in silence. I noticed that now and then his eyes rested on me with a faint smile of amusement. I waited patiently.
"What have you been up to since I saw you last?"
he asked at length. I had not very much to say. It was a record of hard work and of little adventure, of experiments in this direction and in that, the gradual acquisition of the knowledge of books and of men. I took care to ask Strickland nothing about his own doings. I showed not the least interest in him, and at last I was rewarded. He began to talk of himself, but with his poor gift of expression he gave but indications of what he had gone through, and I had to fill up the gaps with my own imagination. It was tantalising to get no more than hints into a character that interested me so much. It was like making one's way through a mutilated manuscript. I received the impression of a life which was a bitter struggle against every sort of difficulty. But I realised that much which would have seemed horrible to most people did not in the least affect him. Strickland was distinguished from most Englishmen by his perfect indifference to comfort. It did not irk him to live always in one shabby room. He had no need to be surrounded by beautiful things. I do not suppose he had ever noticed how dingy was the paper on the wall of the room in which on my first visit I found him. He did not want armchairs to sit in. He really felt more at his ease on a kitchen chair. He ate with appetite, but was indifferent to what he ate. To him it was only food that he devoured to still the pangs of hunger, and when no food was to be had, he seemed capable of doing without. I learnt that for 6 months he had lived on a loaf of bread and a bottle of milk a day. He was a sensual man, and yet was indifferent to sensual things. He looked upon privation as no hardship. There was something impressive in the manner in which he lived a life wholly of the spirit. When the small sum of money which he had brought with him from London came to an end, he suffered from no dismay. He sold no pictures. I think he made little attempt to sell any. He set about finding some way to make a bit of money. He told me with grim humour of the time he had spent acting as a guide to cockneys who wanted to see the night side of life in Paris. It was an occupation that appealed to his sardonic temper, and somehow or other he had acquired a wide acquaintance with the more disreputable quarters of the city. He told me of the long hours he spent walking about the Boulevard de la Madeleine on the look out for Englishmen, preferably the worse for liquor, who desired to see things which the law forbade. When in luck he was able to make a tidy sum, but the shabbiness of his clothes at last frightened the sightseers, and he could not find people adventurous enough to trust themselves to him. Then he happened on a job to translate the advertisements of patent medicines which were sent broadcast to the medical profession in England. During a strike he had been employed as a house painter. Meanwhile he had never ceased to work at his art, but, soon tiring of the studios, entirely by himself. He had never been so poor that he could not buy canvas and paint, and really he needed nothing else. So far as I could make out, he painted with great difficulty, and in his unwillingness to accept help from anyone, lost much time in finding out for himself the solution of technical problems which preceding generations had already worked out one by one. He was aiming at something, I knew not what, and perhaps he hardly knew himself, and I got again more strongly the impression of a man possessed. He did not seem quite sane. It seemed to me that he would not show his pictures because he was really not interested in them. He lived in a dream, and the reality meant nothing to him. I had the feeling that he worked on a canvas with all the force of his violent personality, oblivious to everything in his effort to get what he saw with the mind's eye. And then, having finished, not the picture perhaps, for I had an idea that he seldom brought anything to completion, but the passion that fired him, he lost all care for it. He was never satisfied with what he had done. It seemed to him of no consequence compared with the vision that obsessed his mind. "Why don't you ever send your work to exhibitions?" I asked. "I should have thought you'd like to know what people thought about it."
Would you?
I cannot describe the immeasurable contempt he put into the two words. "Don't you want fame? It's something that most artists haven't been indifferent to."
Children, how can you care for the opinion of the crowd when you don't care twopence for the opinion of the individual?"
"We're not all reasonable beings," I laughed.
Who makes fame? Critics, writers, stockbrokers, women?
"Wouldn't it give you a rather pleasing sensation to think of people you didn't know and had never seen receiving emotions, subtle and passionate, from the work of your hands? Everyone likes power. I can't imagine a more wonderful exercise of it than to move the souls of men to pity or terror."
Melodrama.
"Why do you mind if you paint well or badly?"
I don't. I only want to paint what I see.
I wonder if I could write on a desert island with the certainty that no eyes but mine would ever see what I had written. Strickland did not speak for a long time, but his eyes shone strangely, as though he saw something that kindled his soul to ecstasy.
Sometimes I've thought of an island lost in a boundless sea, where I could live in some hidden valley, among strange trees in silence. There I think I could find what I want.
He did not express himself quite like this. He used gestures instead of adjectives, and he halted. I have put into my own words what I think he wanted to say. "Looking back on the last 5 years, do you think it was worth it?" I asked. He looked at me, and I saw that he did not know what I meant. I explained. "You gave up a comfortable home and a life as happy as the average. You were fairly prosperous. You seem to have had a rotten time in Paris. If you had your time over again, would you do what you did?"
Rather.
"Do you know, you haven't asked anything about your wife and children? Do you never think of them?"
No.
"I wish you weren't so damned monosyllabic. Have you never had a moment's regret for all the unhappiness you caused them?" His lips broke into a smile, and he shook his head. "I should have thought sometimes you couldn't help thinking of the past. I don't mean the past of 7 or 8 years ago, but further back still, when you first met your wife and loved her and married her. Don't you remember the joy with which you first took her in your arms?"
I don't think of the past. The only thing that matters is the everlasting present.
I thought for a moment over this reply. It was obscure, perhaps, but I thought I saw dimly his meaning. "Are you happy?" I asked.
Yes.
I was silent. I looked at him reflectively. He held my stare, and presently a sardonic twinkle lit up his eyes.
I'm afraid you disapprove of me.
"Nonsense," I answered promptly. "I don't disapprove of the boa constrictor. On the contrary, I'm interested in his mental processes."
It's a purely professional interest you take in me.
"Purely."
It's only right that you shouldn't disapprove of me. You have a despicable character.
"Perhaps that's why you feel at home with me," I retorted. He smiled dryly, but said nothing. I wish I knew how to describe his smile. I do not know that it was attractive, but it lit up his face, changing the expression, which was generally sombre, and gave it a look of not ill-natured malice. It was a slow smile, starting and sometimes ending in the eyes. It was very sensual, neither cruel nor kindly, but suggested rather the inhuman glee of the satyr. It was his smile that made me ask him, "Haven't you been in love since you came to Paris?"
I haven't got time for that sort of nonsense. Life isn't long enough for love and art.
"Your appearance doesn't suggest the anchorite."
All that business fills me with disgust.
"Human nature is a nuisance, isn't it?" I said.
Why are you sniggering at me?
"Because I don't believe you."
Then you're a damned fool."
I paused, and I looked at him searchingly. "What's the good of trying to humbug me?" I said.
"I don't know what you mean."
I smiled. "Let me tell you. I imagine that for months the matter never comes into your head, and you're able to persuade yourself that you've finished with it for good and all. You rejoice in your freedom, and you feel that at last you can call your soul your own. You seem to walk with your head among the stars. And then, all of a sudden, you can't stand it any more, and you notice that all the time your feet have been walking in the mud, and you want to roll yourself in it, and you find some woman coarse and low and vulgar, some beastly creature in whom all the horror of sex is blatant, and you fall upon her like a wild animal. You drink till you're blind with rage." He stared at me without the slightest movement. I held his eyes with mine. I spoke very slowly. "I'll tell you what must seem strange, that when it's over you feel so extraordinarily pure. You feel like a disembodied spirit, immaterial, and you seem to be able to touch beauty as though it were a palpable thing, and you feel an intimate communion with the breeze, and with the trees breaking into leaf, and with the iridescence of the river. You feel like God. Can you explain that to me?" He kept his eyes fixed on mine till I had finished, and then he turned away. There was on his face a strange look, and I thought that so might a man look when he had died under the torture. He was silent. I knew that our conversation was ended. Chapter 22. I settled down in Paris and began to write a play. I led a very regular life, working in the morning, and in the afternoon lounging about the gardens of the Luxembourg or sauntering through the streets. I spent long hours in the Louvre, the most friendly of all galleries and the most convenient for meditation, or idled on the quays, fingering second-hand books that I never meant to buy. I read a page here and there, and made acquaintance with a great many authors whom I was content to know thus desultorily. In the evenings I went to see my friends. I looked in often on the Strovers, and sometimes shared their modest fare. Dirk Stroeve flattered himself on his skill in cooking Italian dishes, and I confess that his spaghetti were very much better than his pictures. It was a dinner for a king when he brought in a huge dish of it, succulent with tomatoes, and we ate it together with the good household bread and a bottle of red wine. I grew more intimate with Blanche Stroeve, and I think, because I was English and she knew few English people, she was glad to see me. She was pleasant and simple, but she remained always rather silent, and I knew not why, gave me the impression that she was concealing something. But I thought that was perhaps no more than a natural reserve, accentuated by the verbose frankness of her husband. Dirk never concealed anything. He discussed the most intimate matters with a complete lack of self-consciousness. Sometimes he embarrassed his wife, and the only time I saw her put out of countenance was when he insisted on telling me that he had taken a purge, and went into somewhat realistic details on the subject. The perfect seriousness with which he narrated his misfortunes convulsed me with laughter, and this added to Mrs. Stroeve's irritation. "You seem to like making a fool of yourself," she said. His round eyes grew rounder still, and his brow puckered in dismay as he saw that she was angry. "Sweetheart, have I vexed you? I'll never take another. It was only because I was bilious. I lead a sedentary life. I don't take enough exercise. For 3 days I hadn't..." "For goodness' sake, hold your tongue," she interrupted, tears of annoyance in her eyes. His face fell, and he pouted his lips like a scolded child. He gave me a look of appeal, so that I might put things right, but unable to control myself, I shook with helpless laughter. We went one day to the picture dealer, in whose shop Stroeve thought he could show me at least 2 or 3 of Strickland's pictures. But when we arrived, we were told that Strickland himself had taken them away. The dealer did not know why. "But don't imagine to yourself that I make myself bad blood on that account. I took them to oblige Monsieur Stroeve, and I said I would sell them if I could. But really..." He shrugged his shoulders.
I'm interested in the young man, but, voyons, you yourself, Monsieur Stroeve, you don't think there's any talent there?"
"I give you my word of honour, there's no one painting to day in whose talent I'm more convinced. Take my word for it, you are missing a good affair. Some day those pictures will be worth more than all you have in your shop. Remember Monet, who could not get any one to buy his pictures for 100 francs. What are they worth now?" "True, but there were 100 as good painters as Monet who couldn't sell their pictures at that time, and their pictures are worth nothing still. How can one tell? Is merit enough to bring success? Don't believe it. The rest, it has still to be proved that this friend of yours has merit. No one claims it for him but Monsieur Stroeve." "And how then will you recognise merit?" asked Dirk, red in the face with anger. "There is only one way, by success." "Philistine!" cried Dirk. "But think of all the great artists of the past. Raphael, Michelangelo, Ingres, Delacroix. They were all successful." "Let us go," said Stroeve to me, "or I shall kill this man."
End of chapter 22. Chapter 23. I saw Strickland not infrequently, and now and then played chess with him. He was of uncertain temper. Sometimes he would sit silent and abstracted, taking no notice of anyone, and at others, when he was in a good humour, he would talk in his own halting way. He never said a clever thing, but he had a vein of brutal sarcasm which was not ineffective, and he always said exactly what he thought. He was indifferent to the susceptibilities of others, and when he wounded them was amused. He was constantly offending Dirk Stroeve, so bitterly that he flung away, vowing he would never speak to him again. But there was a solid force in Strickland that attracted the fat Dutchman against his will, so that he came back, fawning like a clumsy dog, though he knew that his only greeting would be the blow he dreaded. I don't know why Strickland put up with me. Our relations were peculiar. One day he asked me to lend him 50 francs. "I wouldn't dream of it," I replied. "Why not?" "It wouldn't amuse me." "I'm frightfully hard up, you know." "I don't care." "You don't care if I starve?" "Why on earth should I?" I asked in my turn. He looked at me for a minute or two, pulling his untidy beard. I smiled at him. "What are you amused at?" he said, with a gleam of anger in his eyes. "You're so simple. You recognise no obligations. No one is under any obligation to you." "Wouldn't it make you uncomfortable if I went and hanged myself because I'd been turned out of my room as I couldn't pay the rent?" "Not a bit." He chuckled. "You're bragging. If I really did, you'd be overwhelmed with remorse." "Try it, and we'll see," I retorted. A smile flickered in his eyes, and he stirred his absinthe in silence. "Would you like to play chess?" I asked. "I don't mind." We set up the pieces, and when the board was ready he considered it with a comfortable eye. There is a sense of satisfaction in looking at your men all ready for the fray. "Did you really think I'd lend you money?" I asked. "I didn't see why you shouldn't." "You surprise me." "Why?" "It's disappointing to find that at heart you're sentimental. I should have liked you better if you hadn't made that ingenuous appeal to my sympathies." "I should have despised you if you'd been moved by it," he answered. "That's better." I laughed. We began to play. We were both absorbed in the game. When it was finished, I said to him: "Look here, if you're hard up, let me see your pictures. If there's anything I like, I'll buy it." "Go to hell," he answered. He got up and was about to go away. I stopped him. "You haven't paid for your absinthe," I said, smiling. He cursed me, flung down the money, and left. I did not see him for several days after that.
But one evening, when I was sitting in the cafe reading a paper, he came up and sat beside me. "You haven't hanged yourself after all," I remarked.
"No, I've got a commission. I'm painting the portrait of a retired plumber for 200 francs.
Author's note. This picture, formerly in the possession of a wealthy manufacturer at Lille, who fled from that city on the approach of the Germans, is now in the National Gallery at Stockholm. The Swede is adept at the gentle pastime of fishing in troubled waters. How did you manage that?"
The woman where I get my bread recommended me. He told her he was looking out for someone to paint him. I've got to give her 20 francs.
What's he like?
Splendid. He's got a great red face like a leg of mutton, and on his right cheek there's an enormous mole with long hairs growing out of it.
Strickland was in a good humour, and when Dirk Stroeve came up and sat down with us, he attacked him with ferocious banter. He showed a skill I should never have credited him with in finding the places where the unhappy Dutchman was most sensitive. Strickland employed not the rapier of sarcasm, but the bludgeon of invective. The attack was so unprovoked that Stroeve, taken unawares, was defenceless. He reminded you of a frightened sheep running aimlessly hither and thither. He was startled and amazed. At last the tears ran from his eyes, and the worst of it was that though you hated Strickland and the exhibition was horrible, it was impossible not to laugh. Dirk Stroeve was one of those unlucky persons whose most sincere emotions are ridiculous. But after all, when I look back upon that winter in Paris, my pleasantest recollection is of Dirk Stroeve. There was something very charming in his little household. He and his wife made a picture which the imagination gratefully dwelt upon, and the simplicity of his love for her had a deliberate grace. He remained absurd, but the sincerity of his passion excited one's sympathy. I could understand how his wife must feel for him, and I was glad that her affection was so tender. If she had any sense of humour, it must amuse her that he should place her on a pedestal and worship her with such an honest idolatry. But even while she laughed, she must have been pleased and touched. He was the constant lover, and though she grew old, losing her rounded lines and her fair comeliness, to him she would certainly never alter. To him she would always be the loveliest woman in the world. There was a pleasing grace in the orderliness of their lives. They had but the studio, a bedroom, and a tiny kitchen. Mrs. Stroeve did all the housework herself, and while Dirk painted bad pictures, she went marketing, cooked the luncheon, sewed, occupied herself like a busy ant all the day, and in the evening sat in the studio, sewing again, while Dirk played music which I am sure was far beyond her comprehension. He played with taste, but with more feeling than was always justified, and into his music poured all his honest, sentimental, exuberant soul. Their life, in its own way, was an idyll, and it managed to achieve a singular beauty. The absurdity that clung to everything connected with Dirk Stroeve gave it a curious note, like an unresolved discord, but made it somehow more modern, more human, like a rough joke thrown into a serious scene. It heightened the poignancy which all beauty has. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24. Shortly before Christmas, Dirk Stroeve came to ask me to spend the holiday with him. He had a characteristic sentimentality about the day, and wanted to pass it among his friends with suitable ceremonies. Neither of us had seen Strickland for 2 or 3 weeks. I, because I had been busy with friends who were spending a little while in Paris, and Stroeve because, having quarrelled with him more violently than usual, he had made up his mind to have nothing more to do with him. Strickland was impossible, and he swore never to speak to him again. But the season touched him with gentle feeling, and he hated the thought of Strickland spending Christmas Day by himself. He ascribed his own emotions to him, and could not bear that on an occasion given up to good fellowship the lonely painter should be abandoned to his own melancholy. Stroeve had set up a Christmas tree in his studio, and I suspected that we should both find absurd little presents hanging on its festive branches. But he was shy about seeing Strickland again. It was a little humiliating to forgive so easily insults so outrageous, and he wished me to be present at the reconciliation on which he was determined. We walked together down the Avenue de Clichy, but Strickland was not in the cafe. It was too cold to sit outside, and we took our places on leather benches within. It was hot and stuffy, and the air was grey with smoke. Strickland did not come, but presently we saw the French painter who occasionally played chess with him. I had formed a casual acquaintance with him, and he sat down at our table. Stroeve asked him if he had seen Strickland. "He's ill," he said. "Didn't you know?" "Seriously?" "Very, I understand." Stroeve's face grew white. "Why didn't he write and tell me? How stupid of me to quarrel with him! We must go to him at once. He can have no one to look after him. Where does he live?" "I've no idea," said the Frenchman. We discovered that none of us knew how to find him. Stroeve grew more and more distressed. "He might die, and not a soul would know anything about it. It's dreadful. I can't bear the thought. We must find him at once." I tried to make Stroeve understand that it was absurd to hunt vaguely about Paris. We must first think of some plan. "Yes, but all this time he may be dying, and when we get there it may be too late to do anything." "Sit still and let us think," I said impatiently. The only address I knew was the Hotel des Belges, but Strickland had long left that, and they would have no recollection of him. With that queer idea of his to keep his whereabouts secret, it was unlikely that on leaving he had said where he was going. Besides, it was more than 5 years ago. I felt pretty sure that he had not moved far. If he continued to frequent the same cafe as when he had stayed at the hotel, it was probably because it was the most convenient. Suddenly I remembered that he had got his commission to paint a portrait through the baker from whom he bought his bread, and it struck me that there one might find his address. I called for a directory and looked out the bakers. There were 5 in the immediate neighbourhood, and the only thing was to go to all of them. Stroeve accompanied me unwillingly. His own plan was to run up and down the streets that led out of the Avenue de Clichy and ask at every house if Strickland lived there. My commonplace scheme was, after all, effective, for in the second shop we asked at, the woman behind the counter acknowledged that she knew him. She was not certain where he lived, but it was in one of the 3 houses opposite. Luck favoured us, and in the first we tried, the concierge told us that we should find him on the top floor. "It appears that he's ill," said Stroeve. "Oh, it may be," answered the concierge indifferently. "En effet, I have not seen him for several days." Stroeve ran up the stairs ahead of me, and when I reached the top floor I found him talking to a workman in his shirt sleeves, who had opened a door at which Stroeve had knocked. He pointed to another door. He believed that the person who lived there was a painter. He had not seen him for a week. Stroeve made as though he was about to knock, and then turned to me with a gesture of helplessness. I saw that he was panic-stricken. "Supposing he's dead?" "Not he," I said. I knocked. There was no answer. I tried the handle and found the door unlocked. I walked in, and Stroeve followed me. The room was in darkness. I could only see that it was an attic with a sloping roof, and a faint glimmer, no more than a less profound obscurity, came from a skylight. "Strickland!" I called. There was no answer. It was really rather mysterious, and it seemed to me that Stroeve, standing just behind, was trembling in his shoes. For a moment I hesitated to strike a light. I dimly perceived a bed in the corner, and I wondered whether the light would disclose lying on it a dead body. "Haven't you got a match, you fool?" Strickland's voice, coming out of the darkness harshly, made me start. Stroeve cried out, "Oh, my God, I thought you were dead." I struck a match and looked about for a candle. I had a rapid glimpse of a tiny apartment, half room, half studio, in which was nothing but a bed, canvases with their face to the wall, an easel, a table, and a chair. There was no carpet on the floor. There was no fireplace. On the table, crowded with paints, palette knives, and litter of all kinds, was the end of a candle. I lit it. Strickland was lying in the bed, uncomfortably because it was too small for him, and he had put all his clothes over him for warmth. It was obvious at a glance that he was in a high fever. Stroeve, his voice cracking with emotion, went up to him. "Oh, my poor friend, what is the matter with you? I had no idea you were ill. Why didn't you let me know? You must know I'd have done anything in the world for you. Were you thinking of what I said? I didn't mean it. I was wrong. It was stupid of me to take offence."
"Go to hell," said Strickland.
"Now, be reasonable. Let me make you comfortable. Haven't you anyone to look after you?" He looked round the squalid attic in dismay. He tried to arrange the bedclothes. Strickland, breathing laboriously, kept an angry silence. He gave me a resentful glance. I stood quite quietly looking at him.
"If you want to do something for me, you can get me some milk," he said at last. "I haven't been able to get out for 2 days."
There was an empty bottle by the side of the bed, which had contained milk, and in a piece of newspaper a few crumbs. "What have you been having?" I asked.
"Nothing."
"For how long?" cried Stroeve. "Do you mean to say you've had nothing to eat or drink for 2 days? It's horrible."
"I've had water."
His eyes dwelt for a moment on a large can within reach of an outstretched arm. "I'll go immediately," said Stroeve. "Is there anything you fancy?" I suggested that he should get a thermometer and a few grapes and some bread. Stroeve, glad to make himself useful, clattered down the stairs.
"Damn fool,"
muttered Strickland. I felt his pulse. It was beating quickly and feebly. I asked him 1 or 2 questions, but he would not answer, and when I pressed him he turned his face irritably to the wall. The only thing was to wait in silence. In 10 minutes Stroeve, panting, came back. Besides what I had suggested, he bought candles and meat juice and a spirit lamp. He was a practical little fellow, and without delay set about making bread and milk. I took Strickland's temperature. It was 104. He was obviously very ill. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25. Presently we left him. Dirk was going home to dinner, and I proposed to find a doctor and bring him to see Strickland. But when we got down into the street, fresh after the stuffy attic, the Dutchman begged me to go immediately to his studio. He had something in mind which he would not tell me, but he insisted that it was very necessary for me to accompany him. Since I did not think a doctor could at the moment do any more than we had done, I consented. We found Blanche Stroeve laying the table for dinner. Dirk went up to her and took both her hands. "Dear one, I want you to do something for me," he said. She looked at him with the grave cheerfulness which was one of her charms. His red face was shining with sweat, and he had a look of comic agitation, but there was in his round, surprised eyes an eager light. "Strickland is very ill. He may be dying. He is alone in a filthy attic, and there is not a soul to look after him. I want you to let me bring him here." She withdrew her hands quickly. I had never seen her make so rapid a movement, and her cheeks flushed. "Oh, no!" "Oh, my dear one, don't refuse. I couldn't bear to leave him where he is. I shouldn't sleep a wink for thinking of him." "I have no objection to your nursing him." Her voice was cold and distant. "But he'll die." "Let him." Stroeve gave a little gasp. He wiped his face. He turned to me for support, but I did not know what to say. "He's a great artist." "What do I care? I hate him." "Oh, my love, my precious, you don't mean that. I beseech you to let me bring him here. We can make him comfortable. Perhaps we can save him. He shall be no trouble to you. I will do everything. We'll make him up a bed in the studio. We can't let him die like a dog. It would be inhuman." "Why can't he go into a hospital?" A hospital. He needs the care of loving hands. He must be treated with infinite tact." I was surprised to see how moved she was. She went on laying the table, but her hands trembled. "I have no patience with you. Do you think if you were ill he would stir a finger to help you? But what does that matter? I should have you to nurse me. It wouldn't be necessary. And besides, I'm different. I'm not of any importance. You have no more spirit than a mongrel cur. You lie down on the ground and ask people to trample on you." Stroeve gave a little laugh. He thought he understood the reason of his wife's attitude. "Oh, my poor dear, you're thinking of that day he came to look at my pictures. What does it matter if he didn't think them any good? It was stupid of me to show them to him. I dare say they're not very good." He looked round the studio ruefully. On the easel was a half-finished picture of a smiling Italian peasant holding a bunch of grapes over the head of a dark-eyed girl. "Even if he didn't like them, he should have been civil. He needn't have insulted you. He showed you he despised you, and you lick his hand. Oh, I hate him." "Dear child, he has genius. You don't think I believe that I have it. I wish I had, but I know it when I see it, and I honour it with all my heart. It's the most wonderful thing in the world. It's a great burden to its possessors. We should be very tolerant with them and very patient." I stood apart, somewhat embarrassed by the domestic scene, and wondered why Stroeve had insisted on my coming with him. I saw that his wife was on the verge of tears. "But it's not only because he's a genius that I ask you to let me bring him here. It's because he's a human being, and he's ill and poor. I will never have him in my house. Never." Stroeve turned to me. "Tell her that it's a matter of life and death. It's impossible to leave him in that wretched hole." "It's quite obvious that it would be much easier to nurse him here," I said. "But of course it would be very inconvenient. I have an idea that someone will have to be with him day and night." "My love, it's not you who would shirk a little trouble." "If he comes here, I shall go," said Mrs. Stroeve violently. "I don't recognise you. You're so good and kind." "Oh, for goodness' sake, let me be. You drive me to distraction." Then at last the tears came. She sank into a chair and buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook convulsively. In a moment Derek was on his knees beside her, with his arms round her, kissing her, calling her all sorts of pet names, and the facile tears ran down his own cheeks. Presently she released herself and dried her eyes. "Leave me alone," she said, not unkindly, and then to me, trying to smile, "What you must think of me." Stroeve looked at her with perplexity, hesitated. His forehead was all puckered and his red mouth set in a pout. He reminded me oddly of an agitated guinea pig. "Then it's no, darling," he said at last. She gave a gesture of lassitude. She was exhausted. "The studio's yours. Everything belongs to you. If you want to bring him here, how can I prevent you?" A sudden smile flashed across his round face. "Then you consent? I knew you would. Oh, my precious!" Suddenly she pulled herself together. She looked at him with haggard eyes. She clasped her hands over her heart as though its beating were intolerable. "Oh, Derek, I've never, since we met, asked you to do anything for me. You know there's nothing in the world I wouldn't do for you. I beg you not to let Strickland come here. Anyone else you like. Bring a thief, a drunkard, any outcast off the streets, and I promise you I'll do everything I can for them gladly. But I beseech you not to bring Strickland here." "But why?" "I am frightened of him. I don't know why. But there's something in him that terrifies me. He'll do us some great harm. I know it. I feel it. If you bring him here, it can only end badly." "But how unreasonable." No, I know I'm right. Something terrible will happen to us." "Because we do a good action." She was panting now, and in her face was a terror which was inexplicable. I do not know what she thought. I felt that she was possessed by some shapeless dread which robbed her of all self-control. As a rule she was so calm. Her agitation now was amazing. Stroeve looked at her for a while with puzzled consternation. "You are my wife. You are dearer to me than any one in the world. No one shall come here without your entire consent." She closed her eyes for a moment, and I thought she was going to faint. I was a little impatient with her. I had not suspected that she was so neurotic a woman. Then I heard Stroeve's voice again. It seemed to break oddly on the silence. "Haven't you been in bitter distress when a helping hand was held out to you? You know how much it means. Couldn't you like to do someone a good turn when you have the chance?" The words were ordinary enough, and to my mind there was in them something so hortatory that I almost smiled. I was astonished at the effect they had on Blanche Stroeve. She started a little and gave her husband a long look. His eyes were fixed on the ground. I did not know why he seemed embarrassed. A faint colour came into her cheeks, and then her face became white, more than white, ghastly. You felt that the blood had shrunk away from the whole surface of her body, and even her hands were pale. A shiver passed through her. The silence of the studio seemed to gather body, so that it became an almost palpable presence. I was bewildered. "Bring Strickland here, Dirk. I'll do my best for him." "My precious," he smiled. He wanted to take her in his arms, but she avoided him. "Don't be affectionate before strangers, Dirk," she said. "It makes me feel such a fool." Her manner was quite normal again, and no one could have told that so shortly before she had been shaken by such a great emotion. End of Chapter 25. Chapter 26. Next day we moved Strickland. It needed a good deal of firmness and still more patience to induce him to come, but he was really too ill to offer any effective resistance to Stroeve's entreaties and to my determination. We dressed him while he feebly cursed us, got him downstairs into a cab, and eventually to Stroeve's studio. He was so exhausted by the time we arrived that he allowed us to put him to bed without a word. He was ill for 6 weeks. At one time it looked as though he could not live more than a few hours, and I am convinced that it was only through the Dutchman's doggedness that he pulled through. I have never known a more difficult patient. It was not that he was exacting and querulous. On the contrary, he never complained. He asked for nothing. He was perfectly silent. But he seemed to resent the care that was taken of him. He received all inquiries about his feelings or his needs with a gibe, a sneer, or an oath. I found him detestable, and as soon as he was out of danger I had no hesitation in telling him so. "Go to hell," he answered briefly. Dirk Stroeve, giving up his work entirely, nursed Strickland with tenderness and sympathy. He was dexterous to make him comfortable, and he exercised a cunning of which I should never have thought him capable, to induce him to take the medicines prescribed by the doctor. Nothing was too much trouble for him. Though his means were adequate to the needs of himself and his wife, he certainly had no money to waste. But now he was wantonly extravagant in the purchase of delicacies, out of season and dear, which might tempt Strickland's capricious appetite. I shall never forget the tactful patience with which he persuaded him to take nourishment. He was never put out by Strickland's rudeness. If it was merely sullen, he appeared not to notice it. If it was aggressive, he only chuckled. When Strickland, recovering somewhat, was in a good humour and amused himself by laughing at him, he deliberately did absurd things to excite his ridicule. Then he would give me little happy glances, so that I might notice in how much better form the patient was. Stroeve was sublime. But it was Blanche who most surprised me. She proved herself not only a capable but a devoted nurse. There was nothing in her to remind you that she had so vehemently struggled against her husband's wish to bring Strickland to the studio. She insisted on doing her share of the offices needful to the sick. She arranged his bed so that it was possible to change the sheet without disturbing him. She washed him. When I remarked on her competence, She told me, with that pleasant little smile of hers, that for a while she had worked in a hospital. She gave no sign that she hated Strickland so desperately. She did not speak to him much, but she was quick to forestall his wants. For a fortnight it was necessary that some one should stay with him all night, and she took turns at watching with her husband. I wondered what she thought during the long darkness as she sat by the bedside. Strickland was a weird figure as he lay there, thinner than ever, with his ragged red beard, and his eyes staring feverishly into vacancy. His illness seemed to have made them larger, and they had an unnatural brightness. "Does he ever talk to you in the night?" I asked her once. "Never." "Do you dislike him as much as you did?" "More, if anything." She looked at me with her calm grey eyes. Her expression was so placid it was hard to believe that she was capable of the violent emotion I had witnessed. "Has he ever thanked you for what you do for him?" "No." She smiled. "He's inhuman." "He's abominable." Stroeve was of course delighted with her. He could not do enough to show his gratitude for the whole-hearted devotion with which she had accepted the burden he laid on her. But he was a little puzzled by the behaviour of Blanche and Strickland towards one another. "Do you know, I have seen them sit there for hours together without saying a word." On one occasion, when Strickland was so much better that in a day or two he was to get up, I sat with them in the studio. Derrick and I were talking. Mrs. Stroeve sewed, and I thought I recognised the shirt that she was mending as Strickland's. He lay on his back. He did not speak. Once I saw that his eyes were fixed on Blanche Stroeve, and there was in them a curious irony. Feeling their gaze, she raised her own, and for a moment they stared at one another. I could not quite understand her expression. Her eyes had in them a strange perplexity and perhaps, but why, alarm. In a moment Strickland looked away and idly surveyed the ceiling, but she continued to stare at him. Now her look was quite inexplicable. In a few days Strickland began to get up. He was nothing but skin and bone. His clothes hung upon him like rags on a scarecrow. With his untidy beard and long hair, his features, always a little larger than life, now emphasised by illness, he had an extraordinary aspect. But it was so odd that it was not quite ugly. There was something monumental in his ungainliness. I do not know how to express precisely the impression he made upon me. It was not exactly spirituality. That was obvious, though the screen of the flesh seemed almost transparent, because there was in his face an outrageous sensuality. But though it sounds nonsense, it seemed as though his sensuality were curiously spiritual. There was in him something primitive. He seemed to partake of those obscure forces of nature which the Greeks personified in shapes part human and part beast, the satyr and the faun. I thought of Marsyas, whom the god flayed because he had dared to rival him in song. Strickland seemed to bear in his heart strange harmonies and unadventured patterns, and I foresaw for him an end of torture and despair. I had again the feeling that he was possessed of a devil, but you could not say that it was a devil of evil, for it was a primitive force that existed before good and ill. He was still too weak to paint, and he sat in the studio, silent, occupied with God knows what dreams, or reading. The books he liked were queer. Sometimes I would find him poring over the poems of Mallarmé, and he read them as a child reads, forming the words with his lips, and I wondered what strange emotion he got from those subtle cadences and obscure phrases. And again I found him absorbed in the detective novels of Gaboriau. I amused myself by thinking that in his choice of books he showed pleasantly the irreconcilable sides of his fantastic nature. It was singular to notice that even in the weak state of his body he had no thought for its comfort. Stroeve liked his ease, and in his studio were a couple of heavily upholstered armchairs and a large divan. Strickland would not go near them, not from any affectation of stoicism, for I found him seated on a three-legged stool when I went into the studio one day, and he was alone, but because he did not like them. For choice, he sat on a kitchen chair without arms. It often exasperated me to see him. I never knew a man so entirely indifferent to his surroundings. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27. 2 or 3 weeks passed. One morning, having come to a pause in my work, I thought I would give myself a holiday, and I went to the Louvre. I wandered about, looking at the pictures I knew so well, and let my fancy play idly with the emotions they suggested. I sauntered into the Long Gallery, and there suddenly saw Stroeve. I smiled, for his appearance, so rotund and yet so startled, could never fail to excite a smile. And then, as I came nearer, I noticed that he seemed singularly disconsolate. He looked woebegone and yet ridiculous, like a man who has fallen into the water with all his clothes on, and, being rescued from death, frightened still, feels that he only looks a fool. Turning round, he stared at me, but I perceived that he did not see me. His round blue eyes looked harassed behind his glasses. "Stroeve," I said. He gave a little start and then smiled, but his smile was rueful. "Why are you idling in this disgraceful fashion?" I asked gaily. "It's a long time since I was at the Louvre. I thought I'd come and see if they had anything new." "But you told me you had to get a picture finished this week." "Strickland's painting in my studio." "Well?" "I suggested it myself. He's not strong enough to go back to his own place yet. I thought we could both paint there. Lots of fellows in the quarter share a studio. I thought it would be fun. I've always thought it would be jolly to have someone to talk to when one was tired of work." He said all this slowly, detaching statement from statement with a little awkward silence, and he kept his kind, foolish eyes fixed on mine. They were full of tears. "I don't think I understand," I said. "Strickland can't work with anyone else in the studio." "Damn it all, it's your studio. That's his lookout." He looked at me pitifully. His lips were trembling. "What happened?" I asked, rather sharply. He hesitated and flushed. He glanced unhappily at one of the pictures on the wall. "He wouldn't let me go on painting. He told me to get out." "But why didn't you tell him to go to hell?" "He turned me out. I couldn't very well struggle with him. He threw my hat after me and locked the door." I was furious with Strickland, and was indignant with myself, because Dirk Stroeve cut such an absurd figure that I felt inclined to laugh. "But what did your wife say?" "She's gone out to do the marketing." "Is he going to let her in?" "I don't know." I gazed at Stroeve with perplexity. He stood like a schoolboy with whom a master is finding fault. "Shall I get rid of Strickland for you?" I asked. He gave a little start, and his shining face grew very red. "No, you'd better not do anything." He nodded to me and walked away. It was clear that for some reason he did not want to discuss the matter. I did not understand. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28. The explanation came a week later. It was about 10 o'clock at night. I had been dining by myself at a restaurant, and having returned to my small apartment, was sitting in my parlour reading. I heard the cracked tinkling of the bell, and, going into the corridor, opened the door. Stroeve stood before me. "Can I come in?" he asked. In the dimness of the landing I could not see him very well, but there was something in his voice that surprised me. I knew he was of abstemious habit, or I should have thought he had been drinking. I led the way into my sitting room and asked him to sit down. "Thank God I've found you," he said. "What's the matter?" I asked in astonishment at his vehemence. I was able now to see him. As a rule he was neat in his person, but now his clothes were in disorder. He looked suddenly bedraggled. I was convinced he had been drinking, and I smiled. I was on the point of chaffing him on his state. "I didn't know where to go," he burst out. I came here earlier, but you weren't in." "I dined late," I said. I changed my mind. It was not liquor that had driven him to this obvious desperation. His face, usually so rosy, was now strangely mottled. His hands trembled. "Has anything happened?" I asked. "My wife has left me." He could hardly get the words out. He gave a little gasp, and the tears began to trickle down his round cheeks. I did not know what to say. My first thought was that she had come to the end of her forbearance with his infatuation for Strickland, and, goaded by the latter's cynical behaviour, had insisted that he should be turned out. I knew her capable of temper, for all the calmness of her manner, and if Stroeve still refused, she might easily have flung out of the studio, with vows never to return. But the little man was so distressed that I could not smile. "My dear fellow, don't be unhappy. She'll come back. You mustn't take very seriously what women say when they're in a passion." You don't understand. She's in love with Strickland." "What?" I was startled at this. But the idea had no sooner taken possession of me than I saw it was absurd. "How can you be so silly? You don't mean to say you're jealous of Strickland?" I almost laughed. "You know very well that she can't bear the sight of him." "You don't understand," he moaned. "You're an hysterical ass," I said a little impatiently. "Let me give you a whisky and soda, and you'll feel better." I suppose that for some reason or other, and heaven knows what ingenuity men exercise to torment themselves, Dirk had got it into his head that his wife cared for Strickland, and with his genius for blundering he might quite well have offended her, so that, to anger him perhaps, she had taken pains to foster his suspicion. "Look here," I said, "let's get back to your studio. If you've made a fool of yourself, you must eat humble pie. Your wife doesn't strike me as the sort of woman to bear malice." "How can I go back to the studio?" he said wearily. "They're there. I've left it to them." "Then it's not your wife who's left you. It's you who've left your wife." "Oh, for God's sake, don't talk to me like that." Still I could not take him seriously. I did not for a moment believe what he had told me. But he was in very real distress. "Well, you've come here to talk to me about it. You'd better tell me the whole story." "This afternoon I couldn't stand it any more. I went to Strickland and told him I thought he was quite well enough to go back to his own place. I wanted the studio myself." "No one but Strickland would have needed telling," I said. "What did he say?" "He laughed a little. You know how he laughs. Not as though he were amused, but as though you were a damn fool, and said he'd go at once. He began to put his things together. You remember I fetched from his room what I thought he needed, and he asked Blanche for a piece of paper and some string to make a parcel." Stroeve stopped, gasping, and I thought he was going to faint. This was not at all the story I'd expected him to tell me. "She was very pale, but she brought the paper and the string. He didn't say anything. He made the parcel and he whistled a tune. He took no notice of either of us. His eyes had an ironic smile in them. My heart was like lead. I was afraid something was going to happen, and I wished I hadn't spoken. He looked round for his hat. Then she spoke. 'I'm going with Strickland, Dirk,' she said. 'I can't live with you any more.' I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Strickland didn't say anything. He went on whistling as though it had nothing to do with him." Stroeve stopped again and mopped his face. I kept quite still. I believed him now, and I was astounded. But all the same I could not understand. Then he told me in a trembling voice, with the tears pouring down his cheeks, how he had gone up to her, trying to take her in his arms, but she had drawn away and begged him not to touch her. He implored her not to leave him. He told her how passionately he loved her, and reminded her of all the devotion he had lavished upon her. He spoke to her of the happiness of their life. He was not angry with her. He did not reproach her. "Please let me go quietly, Dirk," she said at last. "Don't you understand that I love Strickland? Where he goes, I shall go. But you must know that he'll never make you happy. For your own sake, don't go. You can't know what you've got to look forward to." "It's your fault. You insisted on his coming here." He turned to Strickland. "Have mercy on her," he implored him. You can't let her do anything so mad."
"She can do as she chooses," said Strickland. "She's not forced to come."
"My choice is made," she said in a dull voice. Strickland's injurious calm robbed Stroeve of the rest of his self-control. Blind rage seized him, and without knowing what he was doing he flung himself on Strickland. Strickland was taken by surprise, and he staggered, but he was very strong, even after his illness, and in a moment, he did not exactly know how, Stroeve found himself on the floor.
"You funny little man," said Strickland.
Stroeve picked himself up. He noticed that his wife had remained perfectly still, and to be made ridiculous before her increased his humiliation. His spectacles had tumbled off in the struggle, and he could not immediately see them. She picked them up and silently handed them to him. He seemed suddenly to realise his unhappiness, and though he knew he was making himself still more absurd, he began to cry. He hid his face in his hands. The others watched him without a word. They did not move from where they stood. "Oh, my dear," he groaned at last. "How can you be so cruel?" "I can't help myself, Dirk," she answered. "I've worshipped you as no woman was ever worshipped before. If in anything I displeased you, why didn't you tell me, and I'd have changed? I'd have done everything I could for you." She did not answer. Her face was set, and he saw that he was only boring her. She put on a coat and her hat. She moved towards the door, and he saw that in a moment she would be gone. He went up to her quickly and fell on his knees before her, seizing her hands. He abandoned all self-respect. "Oh, don't go, my darling. I can't live without you. I shall kill myself. If I've done anything to offend you, I beg you to forgive me. Give me another chance. I'll try harder still to make you happy. Get up, Dirk. You're making yourself a perfect fool." He staggered to his feet, but still he would not let her go. "Where are you going?" he said hastily. "You don't know what Strickland's place is like. You can't live there. It would be awful. If I don't care, I don't see why you should. Stay a moment longer. I must speak. After all, you can't grudge me that. What's the good? I've made up my mind. Nothing that you can say will make me alter it." He gulped and put his hand to his heart to ease its painful beating. "I'm not going to ask you to change your mind, but I want you to listen to me for a minute. It's the last thing I shall ever ask you. Don't refuse me that." She paused, looking at him with those reflective eyes of hers, which were now so different to him. She came back into the studio and leant against the table. "Well?" Stroeve made a great effort to collect himself. "You must be a little reasonable. You can't live on air, you know. Strickland hasn't got a penny." "I know. You'd suffer the most awful privations. You know why he took so long to get well. He was half starved. I can earn money for him." "How?" "I don't know. I shall find a way." A horrible thought passed through the Dutchman's mind, and he shuddered. "I think you must be mad. I don't know what's come over you." She shrugged her shoulders. "Now can I go?" "Wait 1 second longer." He looked round his studio wearily. He had loved it because her presence had made it gay and homelike. He shut his eyes for an instant. Then he gave her a long look, as though to impress upon his mind the picture of her. He got up and took his hat. "No, I'll go." "You?" She was startled. She did not know what he meant. "I can't bear to think of you living in that horrible, filthy attic. After all, this is your home just as much as mine. You'll be comfortable here. You'll be spared at least the worst privations." He went to the drawer in which he kept his money and took out several banknotes. "I would like to give you half what I've got here." He put them on the table. Neither Strickland nor his wife spoke. Then he recollected something else. "Will you pack up my clothes and leave them with the concierge? I'll come and fetch them tomorrow." He tried to smile. Good bye, my dear. I am grateful for all the happiness you gave me in the past." He walked out and closed the door behind him. With my mind's eye I saw Strickland throw his hat on the table and, sitting down, begin to smoke a cigarette. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29. I kept silence for a little while, thinking of what Stroeve had told me. I could not stomach his weakness, and he saw my disapproval. "You know as well as I do how Strickland lived," he said tremulously. "I couldn't let her live in those circumstances. I simply couldn't." "That's your business," I answered. "What would you have done?" he asked. "She went with her eyes open. If she had to put up with certain inconveniences, it was her own lookout." "Yes, but you see, you don't love her." "Do you love her still?" "Oh, more than ever. Strickland isn't the man to make a woman happy. It can't last. I want her to know that I shall never fail her." "Does that mean that you're prepared to take her back?" "I shouldn't hesitate. Why, she'll want me more than ever then. When she's alone and humiliated and broken, it would be dreadful if she had nowhere to go." He seemed to bear no resentment. I suppose it was commonplace in me that I felt slightly outraged at his lack of spirit. Perhaps he guessed what was in my mind, for he said: "I couldn't expect her to love me as I loved her. I'm a buffoon. I'm not the sort of man that women love. I've always known that. I can't blame her if she's fallen in love with Strickland." "You certainly have less vanity than any man I've ever known," I said. "I love her so much better than myself. It seems to me that when vanity comes into love, it can only be because really you love yourself best. After all, it constantly happens that a man, when he's married, falls in love with somebody else. When he gets over it, he returns to his wife, and she takes him back, and everyone thinks it very natural. Why should it be different with women?" "I dare say that's logical," I smiled. "But most men are made differently, and they can't." But while I talked to Stroeve I was puzzling over the suddenness of the whole affair. I could not imagine that he had had no warning. I remembered the curious look I had seen in Blanche Stroeve's eyes. Perhaps its explanation was that she was growing dimly conscious of a feeling in her heart that surprised and alarmed her. "Did you have no suspicion before today that there was anything between them?" I asked. He did not answer for a while. There was a pencil on the table, and unconsciously he drew a head on the blotting paper. "But please say so if you hate my asking you questions," I said. "It eases me to talk. Oh, if you knew the frightful anguish in my heart!" He threw the pencil down. "Yes, I've known for a fortnight. I knew it before she did." "Why on earth didn't you send Strickland packing?" "I couldn't believe it. It seemed so improbable. She couldn't bear the sight of him. It was more than improbable. It was incredible. I thought it was merely jealousy. You see, I've always been jealous, but I trained myself never to show it. I was jealous of every man she knew. I was jealous of you. I knew she didn't love me as I loved her. That was only natural, wasn't it? But she allowed me to love her, and that was enough to make me happy. I forced myself to go out for hours together in order to leave them by themselves. I wanted to punish myself for suspicions which were unworthy of me. And when I came back, I found they didn't want me. Not Strickland. He didn't care if I was there or not, but Blanche. She shuddered when I went to kiss her. When at last I was certain, I didn't know what to do. I knew they'd only laugh at me if I made a scene. I thought if I held my tongue and pretended not to see, everything would come all right. I made up my mind to get him away quietly without quarrelling. Oh, if you only knew what I had suffered!" Then he told me again of his asking Strickland to go. He chose his moment carefully, and tried to make his request sound casual, but he could not master the trembling of his voice. and he felt himself that into words that he wished to seem jovial and friendly there crept the bitterness of his jealousy. He had not expected Strickland to take him up on the spot and make his preparations to go there and then. Above all, he had not expected his wife's decision to go with him. I saw that now he wished with all his heart that he had held his tongue. He preferred the anguish of jealousy to the anguish of separation. I wanted to kill him, and I only made a fool of myself. He was silent for a long time, and then he said what I knew was in his mind. If I'd only waited, perhaps it would have gone all right. I shouldn't have been so impatient. Oh, poor child, what have I driven her to? I shrugged my shoulders, but did not speak. I had no sympathy for Blanche Stroeve, but knew that it would only pain poor Dirk if I told him exactly what I thought of her. He had reached that stage of exhaustion when he could not stop talking. He went over again every word of the scene. Now something occurred to him that he had not told me before. Now he discussed what he ought to have said instead of what he did say. Then he lamented his blindness. He regretted that he had done this, and blamed himself that he had omitted the other. It grew later and later, and at last I was as tired as he. "What are you going to do now?" I said finally. "What can I do? I shall wait till she sends for me." "Why don't you go away for a bit?" "No, no. I must be at hand when she wants me." For the present he seemed quite lost. He had made no plans. When I suggested that he should go to bed, he said that he could not sleep. He wanted to go out and walk about the streets till day. He was evidently in no state to be left alone. I persuaded him to stay the night with me, and I put him into my own bed. I had a divan in my sitting room, and could very well sleep on that. He was by now so worn out that he could not resist my firmness. I gave him a sufficient dose of veronal to ensure his unconsciousness for several hours. I thought that was the best service I could render him. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30. But the bed I made up for myself was sufficiently uncomfortable to give me a wakeful night, and I thought a good deal of what the unlucky Dutchman had told me. I was not so much puzzled by Blanche Stroeve's action, for I saw in that merely the result of a physical appeal. I do not suppose she had ever really cared for her husband, and what I had taken for love was no more than the feminine response to caresses and comfort, which in the minds of most women passes for it. It is a passive feeling, capable of being roused for any object, as the vine can grow on any tree, and the wisdom of the world recognizes its strength when it urges a girl to marry the man who wants her, with the assurance that love will follow. It is an emotion made up of the satisfaction in security, pride of property, the pleasure of being desired, the gratification of a household, and it is only by an amiable vanity that women ascribe to it spiritual value. It is an emotion which is defenceless against passion. I suspected that Blanche Stroeve's violent dislike of Strickland had in it from the beginning a vague element of sexual attraction. Who am I that I should seek to unravel the mysterious intricacies of sex? Perhaps Stroeve's passion excited without satisfying that part of her nature, and she hated Strickland because she felt in him the power to give her what she needed. I think she was quite sincere when she struggled against her husband's desire to bring him into the studio. I think she was frightened of him, though she knew not why, and I remembered how she had foreseen disaster. I think in some curious way the horror which she felt for him was a transference of the horror which she felt for herself, because he so strangely troubled her. His appearance was wild and uncouth. There was aloofness in his eyes and sensuality in his mouth. He was big and strong. He gave the impression of untamed passion, and perhaps she felt in him, too, that sinister element which had made me think of those wild beings of the world's early history, when matter, retaining its early connection with the earth, seemed to possess yet a spirit of its own. If he affected her at all, it was inevitable that she should love or hate him. She hated him. And then I fancy that the daily intimacy with the sick man moved her strangely. She raised his head to give him food, and it was heavy against her hand. When she had fed him, she wiped his sensual mouth and his red beard. She washed his limbs. They were covered with thick hair, and when she dried his hands, even in his weakness they were strong and sinewy. His fingers were long. They were the capable fashioning fingers of the artist, and I knew not what troubling thoughts they excited in her. He slept very quietly, without a movement, so that he might have been dead, and he was like some wild creature of the woods, resting after a long chase, and she wondered what fancies passed through his dreams. Did he dream of the nymph flying through the woods of Greece with the satyr in hot pursuit? She fled, swift of foot and desperate, but he gained on her step by step, till she felt his hot breath on her neck, and still she fled silently, and silently he pursued, and when at last he seized her, was it terror that thrilled her heart, or was it ecstasy? Blanche Stroeve was in the cruel grip of appetite. Perhaps she hated Strickland still, but she hungered for him, and everything that had made up her life till then became of no account. She ceased to be a woman, complex, kind, and petulant, considerate, and thoughtless. She was a Maenad. She was desire. But perhaps this is very fanciful, and it may be that she was merely bored with her husband, and went to Strickland out of a callous curiosity. She may have had no particular feeling for him, but succumbed to his wish from propinquity or idleness, to find then that she was powerless in a snare of her own contriving. How did I know what were the thoughts and emotions behind that placid brow and those cool grey eyes? But if one could be certain of nothing in dealing with creatures so incalculable as human beings, there were explanations of Blanche Stroeve's behaviour which were, at all events, plausible. On the other hand, I did not understand Strickland at all. I racked my brain, but could in no way account for an action so contrary to my conception of him. It was not strange that he should so heartlessly have betrayed his friend's confidence, nor that he hesitated not at all to gratify a whim at the cost of another's misery. That was in his character. He was a man without any conception of gratitude. He had no compassion. The emotions common to most of us simply did not exist in him, and it was as absurd to blame him for not feeling them as for blaming the tiger because he is fierce and cruel. But it was the whim I could not understand. I could not believe that Strickland had fallen in love with Blanche Stroeve. I did not believe him capable of love. That is an emotion in which tenderness is an essential part. But Strickland had no tenderness either for himself or for others. There is in love a sense of weakness, a desire to protect, an eagerness to do good and to give pleasure, if not unselfishness, at all events a selfishness which marvellously conceals itself. It has in it a certain diffidence. These were not traits which I could imagine in Strickland. Love is absorbing. It takes the lover out of himself. The most clear-sighted, though he may know, cannot realise that his love will cease. It gives body to what he knows is illusion, and knowing it is nothing else, he loves it better than reality. It makes a man a little more than himself, and at the same time a little less. He ceases to be himself. He is no longer an individual, but a thing, an instrument to some purpose foreign to his ego. Love is never quite devoid of sentimentality, and Strickland was the least inclined to that infirmity of any man I have known. I could not believe that he would ever suffer that possession of himself which love is. He could never endure a foreign yoke. I believed him capable of uprooting from his heart, though it might be with agony, so that he was left battered and ensanguined, anything that came between himself and that uncomprehended craving that urged him constantly to he knew not what. If I have succeeded at all in giving the complicated impression that Strickland made on me, it will not seem outrageous to say that I felt he was at once too great and too small for love. But I suppose that everyone's conception of the passion is formed on his own idiosyncrasies, and it is different with every different person. A man like Strickland would love in a manner peculiar to himself. It was vain to seek the analysis of his emotion. Chapter 30